Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right in today because our goal is to clear up the massive confusion surrounding three of the most heavily used and honestly most misunderstood terms in our modern vocabulary: capitalism, socialism, and communism. Look, if you spend literally any time on social media, watch the news, or listen to political debates, you know these words get thrown around all the time. They're used as weapons, buzzwords, rallying cries, you name it. But because of all that political mudslinging, their actual historical definitions are almost completely buried. So we're going to unpack exactly what these terms mean, completely objectively, right here, right now.
But before we even try to define anything, I've got a question for you, and the answer might actually come as a pretty massive surprise. Has there ever been a true communist country? Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, what about the Cold War? What about the Soviet Union, or modern-day China and North Korea? Well, according to the historical and economic sources we're looking at today, the answer is actually no. While those nations have heavily described themselves as communist, a true communist state, by its strict economic definition, has never actually existed in the modern world. We're going to find out exactly why that is, and why the label gets misused so often in just a bit.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for the Explainer today. First, we'll tackle the great economic confusion. Second, we're defining the big three. Third, we'll look at Marx and the progression. Fourth, we'll compare theory versus reality. And finally, we will map it all out on the modern economic continuum.
All right, Section 1, the Great Economic Confusion. We just have to acknowledge right out of the gate that modern media and politics totally muddle these words. Their true meanings are frequently obscured by political alliances or just deliberate attempts to mislead people.
The single biggest misconception we absolutely have to clear up right away is the difference between economics and politics. Capitalism, socialism, and communism are, at their root, purely economic systems. They just describe who owns the wealth, the capital, and the means of production in a society. That is it. They are entirely separate from political systems. For instance, people constantly equate capitalism with democracy, or they equate communism with dictatorships. But democracy is a political system about how you vote and choose leaders. Capitalism is an economic system about who owns the money and the factories. If we just separate the economics from the politics, these terms become infinitely easier to grasp. So, moving to Section 2, defining the big three. To really understand these terms, we have to travel back in time to their historical roots. Knowing where and why these concepts originated during the Industrial Revolution is the absolute key to making sense of them.
If we rewind to the Industrial Revolution, the world was going through this violent, totally unprecedented transformation. Picture it, cities exploding with smog-filled factories, child labor everywhere, and a sudden, massive divide between extreme wealth and crushing poverty. Well, that environment sparked some rapidly evolving economic theories. In the 1830s, the terms capitalism and socialism first came into widespread use to describe what was happening. By the 1840s, the word communism was coined in France. Shortly after, in 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto, leading eventually to major geopolitical shifts like the Russian Revolution in 1917. Let's break down each of these emerging terms in their original historical context.
First up, capitalism. This system emerged in Great Britain in the 1830s as the old, rigid policy of mercantilism was finally being abandoned. Under mercantilism, kings and governments heavily controlled trade just to hoard national wealth. So the shift to capitalism was a massive historical leap. Suddenly, the focus was entirely on the individual. Capitalism describes a system where wealth, or capital, is owned by individuals or private companies. The primary goal is personal profit, and the production and distribution of goods are determined by a free market of supply and demand, rather than by heavy-handed government regulation or a king.
Emerging at the exact same time, and really as a direct reaction to the pretty brutal conditions of early industrial capitalism, was socialism. You've got to remember the motivation here. People were watching factory workers endure 16-hour days in highly dangerous, squalid conditions, while the factory owners grew immensely wealthy. Socialism held that groups of people, or the state acting on their behalf, should own and regulate the economy for the benefit of all members, not just a wealthy few. It sought distributive justice, aiming to socialize production so that the community benefits from shared resources and a basic safety net.
And then we have communism. Coined in France in the 1840s, it derives from the word common, meaning free or open to everyone. It describes a system of total collective ownership, where individuals don't own private property at all. Both production and consumption are socialized. But here is the most crucial part to understand. The ultimate theoretical goal of communism is a stateless, classless, and moneyless society that works entirely for the benefit of all. Think about how radical of a conceptual shift that is. No money, no social classes, not even a government. As we'll see, that incredibly radical goal is exactly why it has proven so incredibly difficult to achieve in reality.
Which brings us to Section 3, Marx and the Progression. Enter Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 1850s, who took the term communism and completely transformed how the world views these three definitions.
See, Marx didn't view these systems like choices on a political menu. He viewed them as an inevitable law of human evolution. It's kind of like how a caterpillar is destined to become a butterfly. Marx believed society had to naturally progress through these exact stages. According to his theory, as Europe transitioned from centralized monarchies to capitalism, it was only a matter of time before a social revolution occurred. He saw socialism as the next logical step, just a transitional precursor stage, where a state controls the means of production on behalf of the workers. Once that state had enough control to totally reorganize society, it would ultimately dissolve itself, allowing society to evolve into Step 3, true, stateless, classless communism.
And this brilliantly illustrates the engine driving this entire Marxist theory: class conflict. Marx believed the capitalist system was inherently exploitative simply because of the mathematical reality of profit. He divided society into two major classes. You've got the proletariat, which is the massive working class who basically have to sell their time and labor just to survive. On the other side is the bourgeoisie, the minority owning class who derive their profit directly from employing the proletariat through private ownership. In Marx's eyes, because the owners always needed to pay the workers less than the actual value of their labor in order to make a profit, conflict wasn't just likely, it was an absolute, unavoidable mathematical certainty.
The theoretical end goal of this inevitable revolution is perfectly summarized by this famous Marxist principle: from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. In this ultimate communist stage, equality of outcome is the absolute priority. To put that into plain terms, imagine a doctor and a janitor. They obviously have entirely different abilities, training, and outputs. But if both need a certain amount of food and housing for their families, both receive exactly that. There's no money to divide them, no class distinction between their professions, and theoretically, no state government forcing them to do it. Everyone contributes what they can, and everyone simply takes what they need.
So, let's pivot to Section 4, Theory versus Reality. Because while these theories sound highly structured and idealistic on paper, history has shown us that human execution tells a remarkably different story. The way these ideas were actually implemented in the 20th century deeply fractured the socialist movement.
So the crucial point is that in practice, this ideology hit a massive fork in the road. One path became Western democratic socialism, which works within a parliamentary democracy. It aims for a sort of incremental reduction in inequality, really focusing on equality of opportunity by mixing public intervention with private enterprise. The other path became state communism, like what we saw in the Soviet Union or China. This path relies heavily on revolution and an authoritarian state, literally removing democratic norms, voting rights, and individual liberties in a forceful attempt to mandate an absolute equality of outcome. To really highlight the stark reality of this authoritarian approach, we look to the famous author George Orwell. What makes Orwell's critique so incredibly powerful is his own background. Orwell was a committed fighting socialist. He literally took a bullet to the throat fighting for the socialist cause during the Spanish Civil War. Yet he was deeply critical of the Soviet-backed communists. He observed that because of their ruthless authoritarian tactics, cracking down on basic liberties, executing political rivals, crushing free speech, the communists had actually betrayed the working class. In practice, they behaved much more like extreme right-wing dictatorships than liberators.
This impartial look at history actually answers our question from the very beginning of the explainer. Why did the socialist precursor stage fail to evolve into true communism in places like the former USSR, Venezuela, or North Korea? Well, think about human nature for a second. To redistribute all wealth and perfectly manage an entire economy, you have to give the state absolute, unquestioned power. And human history tells us that people rarely give up absolute power once they have it. Leaders abused that immense state control. Corruption ran rampant, and those authoritarian figures flat out refused to relinquish power back to the people, which just resulted in a total loss of individual liberty rather than the stateless, free society Marx predicted.
However, the sources also point out a really fascinating reality. Variations of socialist ideals have actually seen incredible success when they are integrated into capitalist societies. Think of things like universal healthcare, public schools, or tax-funded fire departments.
These are deeply socialist concepts operating successfully within capitalist free market democracies like Sweden, Canada, and the UK. They provide essential social safety nets for the vulnerable without destroying the engine of free market innovation and private property. It turns out blending the two has created some of the highest standards of living in human history.
Which leads us to our final section, the modern economic continuum. We're going to bring this explainer home by returning to our central premise. To truly understand the modern world, we absolutely must stop viewing these terms as rigid absolutes and start viewing them as points on a sliding scale.
And just as a quick reminder, the number of purely capitalist countries in the world today is exactly 0. A purely capitalist country would mean 0 government regulation, no child labor laws, no food safety standards, no minimum wage, no anti-monopoly laws. Literally no modern society wants that. Likewise, the number of purely communist countries, stateless, classless societies with absolutely no money is also 0. Every single modern economy on the planet today is a mixed economy to some degree.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Instead of rigid boxes, think of modern global economics as a sliding scale. On one extreme pole, you have a pure free market, driven entirely by individual profit, private ownership, and 0 government intervention. On the far opposite pole, you have a pure command economy, characterized by total collective ownership, heavy state planning, and 0 private property. Every nation on Earth floats somewhere along this continuum, just trying to balance between individual liberty and state regulation.
So what does this all mean? What should you actually take away from this explainer? First, understanding the historical roots of these words completely clears up the confusion. Second, separate the actual economics from the political buzzwords. Knowing this genuinely protects you from being manipulated by politicians or modern media. Third, recognize that all nations sit on an economic continuum. Pure capitalism and pure communism are just myths in the modern world. And finally, the real debate today isn't some cartoonish fight of capitalism versus communism. It's a very practical debate about deciding the appropriate level of regulation and social safety nets for your specific society.
I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder. Take a slow, objective look at your own country through this newly clarified lens. Where does your society currently sit on this economic continuum? And more importantly, knowing what you know now, where do you think it should be? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep learning.